I still remember the exact night because it felt ordinary in every possible way, and that is what makes it hard to forget. It was a little after 11, the kind of time when the city isn't asleep but it's no longer awake either, and I was walking home because I wanted the quiet more than I wanted the bus, even though the air was cold and damp and my jacket smelled faintly of rain. The street I took was one I'd walked down hundreds of times before, a long stretch of closed businesses with metal shutters pulled tight and signs switched off, the kind of place that feels hollow at night, like the buildings are just shapes pretending to be useful, and I remember thinking how every step echoed louder than it should have. It had been raining earlier, not enough to soak through my shoes, but enough to leave the pavement shining under the streetlights, and the reflections made it feel like I was walking through a darker version of the city, where everything looked familiar but slightly wrong. I passed the old bakery first, then the dry cleaner, both of them dark and silent, their windows dusty and empty, and I felt that small sense of relief you get when nothing unexpected happens, because my mind was tired and I didn't want surprises. That's when I noticed the shop at the corner, the one that had been closed for as long as I could remember, the sign faded and crooked, the windows usually black like mirrors at night, and I remember thinking about how strange it was that no one had rented it yet. As I got closer, I slowed down without realizing it, because something about the shop felt different, not wrong exactly, just out of place, like a detail my brain hadn't decided how to process yet. The metal shutter was still down, just like always, and the door was still locked, and for a moment I told myself everything was normal, even though my chest felt a little tighter than it should have. I walked past it, keeping my eyes forward, and I took maybe 3 more steps before the light came on inside. It wasn't sudden like someone flipping a switch fast, but a soft glow that bloomed behind the dusty glass, warm and yellow, filling the interior just enough for me to notice it out of the corner of my eye, and my body reacted before my thoughts did. I stopped walking. I stood there with one foot slightly raised, like I'd been paused mid-step, and I waited for the sound that never came, no click of a switch, no movement, no hum of machinery, just the same quiet street and the same faint hiss of distant traffic. I told myself someone must have gone in through the back, that maybe the shop wasn't as abandoned as I thought, even though I knew there was no back entrance, and that lie felt thin and fragile in my mind. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head and looked at the window, and the light inside didn't flicker or change, it just stayed there, steady and calm, like it had always been on and I had simply failed to notice it until now. The glass was too dirty to see clearly through, smeared with old fingerprints and streaks of grime, but I could make out shapes, shelves maybe, or counters, shadows that felt heavier than they should have, and none of them moved. I waited for something to happen, for someone to step into view or wave or turn the light back off, but nothing did, and the longer I stood there, the more aware I became of how alone I was on that street. I could hear my own breathing, slow and careful, and the faint drip of water from a gutter somewhere above me, and it felt like the night itself was listening, like the silence was paying attention to what I would do next. I checked my phone, pretending I was just passing time, and saw that I'd only been standing there for maybe 15 seconds, even though it felt much longer, and I realized my hand was shaking slightly. Part of me wanted to walk away immediately, to put distance between myself and that window, but another part of me felt pulled toward it, like I needed to understand what I was seeing, even if I didn't like the answer. I took one step closer, then another, stopping just short of the glass, and the light inside didn't change, didn't react, didn't acknowledge me at all, which somehow felt worse than if it had. I leaned in slightly, trying to see past my own reflection, and for a brief moment I thought I saw movement deep inside the shop, something shifting where the light didn't quite reach, and my heart jumped before my brain could catch up. When I focused harder, there was nothing there, just the same empty shapes and shadows, and I felt foolish for being scared of my own imagination, even though the feeling didn't go away. I stood there longer than I should have, telling myself I was waiting for a logical explanation, but really I think I was afraid to turn my back on the window, afraid that something would change the moment I stopped looking. Eventually, I forced myself to step back, and as I did, I noticed something small that made my stomach tighten again. The layer of dust on the inside of the glass was completely undisturbed. Thick and even, like no one had been there in years. That's when the thought hit me, quiet and unwelcome, that the light hadn't just been turned on, it had been waiting. I took another step away, then another, watching the window the whole time, and the light stayed exactly the same, not brighter, not dimmer, just present, like an eye that refused to blink. When I finally turned around and started walking again, my pace was faster, my footsteps louder, and I kept expecting to hear something behind me, a door opening, a voice calling out, anything to break the silence. Nothing did, and that somehow made it worse. I reached the end of the street and didn't look back until I was safely under the next streetlight, and when I did, I could still see the glow from the shop window, faint but unmistakable, burning steadily in the distance. I told myself that I'd imagined the timing, that the light must have already been on, that my tired mind had played a trick on me, but even as I thought it, I knew I didn't believe it. That night, when I finally got home, I stood at my own window for a long time, looking down at the empty street, half expecting to see that same warm light somewhere it didn't belong. I didn't sleep much, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dusty window and the way the light filled it without explanation, and the thought that kept coming back, again and again, was that the shop hadn't felt occupied. It had felt aware. I remember the night because it was raining in a way that felt tired, not heavy, just steady enough to make the streets shine and keep people indoors, and I was walking home later than usual because I had stayed longer at work to avoid going back to an empty apartment. It was close to midnight, and the city felt hollow, the kind of quiet where even distant sounds feel like they belong to someone else's life, and my shoes made soft, careful noises on the wet pavement that seemed too loud in the stillness. I took a shortcut I rarely used, a narrow street that cut behind a row of newer buildings, because I wanted to be home quickly, even though something about that street always made me walk a little faster than normal. The streetlights there were spaced too far apart, leaving long stretches of shadow between them, and I kept finding myself looking ahead instead of around me, like my body didn't want to notice too much. Halfway down the street, I slowed without meaning to, because I saw someone sitting ahead of me, right under one of the streetlights, and at first I felt relief because it meant I wasn't alone anymore. She was sitting on what looked like concrete stairs, elbows resting on her knees, head slightly bowed, completely still, and I assumed it was the entrance to a building I hadn't paid attention to before. As I got closer, I noticed she wasn't holding a phone or a bag or anything at all, just sitting there like she had been placed carefully and forgotten, and that small detail made me uneasy. I glanced around for the building behind her, expecting to see a doorway or at least a wall, but there was only empty space, a stretch of wet asphalt and darkness where a structure should have been. I stopped walking, my heart picking up speed, and I looked again, slower this time, tracing the outline of the stairs with my eyes, and they were real, solid, leading upward into nothing. There was no wall, no door, no sign, no shadow of a building that might explain it, just the stairs rising from the street like a mistake no one had corrected. She didn't move, didn't look at me, didn't seem to notice that anything was wrong, and the rain continued to fall softly around her, dampening the steps and her hair. I told myself I was tired, that my depth perception was off in the dark, and I took a few careful steps closer, feeling the cold air press against my face. The closer I got, the more details I noticed, the dark coat she wore, the way her shoes were placed neatly together, the calmness in her posture that felt out of place in that empty street. I could see her face now, partially shadowed, eyes open but unfocused, staring at something that wasn't there, and I felt like I was intruding on a private moment I didn't understand. I cleared my throat softly, not wanting to scare her, and said hello, my voice sounding thin and uncertain in the open space. She didn't react, not even a blink, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before, like it had weight. I asked if she was okay, louder this time, and I waited for any sign of acknowledgement, a shift, a breath, anything. Nothing happened, and I became painfully aware of how exposed I felt standing there in the rain with no one else around. I looked again for the building, scanning the area more desperately now, and the absence behind her felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, like a missing memory. The stairs were old, worn smooth in the center as if countless feet had climbed them, which made no sense at all. And that thought made my stomach tighten. I took another step forward, and the sound of my shoe on the wet ground seemed to echo too much, and she still didn't move. Up close, I noticed her clothes were dry despite the rain, and that detail stayed with me longer than it should have. I stood there, unsure what to do, torn between leaving and staying, because walking away felt like abandoning something important I didn't understand. I asked her if she needed help, my voice shaking slightly now, and the words felt wrong the moment they left my mouth. Slowly, she turned her head toward me, and the movement was so smooth and deliberate that it made my skin crawl. Her eyes met mine, and there was no surprise in them, no confusion, just a quiet awareness that made me feel like I had arrived late to something already decided. She didn't speak, didn't change her expression, just looked at me like she had been expecting me, and that thought made my chest feel tight. I wanted to ask her why she was there, how the stairs could exist without a building, but the questions felt dangerous, like saying them out loud would make everything worse. The rain seemed to soften around us, the city sounds fading even further, and I realized I couldn't hear anything beyond my own breathing. I took a step back without thinking, and her eyes followed me, slow and steady, never leaving my face. That was when I noticed the stairs didn't cast a proper shadow, and the light from the street lamp behaved strangely around them. My heart was pounding now, and every instinct told me to leave, to put distance between myself and that impossible scene. I turned away and started walking, forcing myself not to run, even though every nerve in my body screamed at me to do exactly that. After a few steps, I glanced back, unable to stop myself, and she was still there, still watching me, still sitting on those stairs. The space behind her was still empty, vast and dark, and it felt like it was growing larger the longer I looked. I walked faster, my breath shallow, the rain soaking into my clothes now that I was no longer paying attention to it. I didn't stop until I reached the end of the street, and even then, I stood under the next streetlight for a long time, trying to steady myself. When I finally looked back again, the stairs were gone, the street empty, as if nothing had ever been there at all. I told myself I had imagined it, that exhaustion and darkness had played tricks on me, even though the explanation felt thin. That night, lying in bed, I kept thinking about her eyes and the way she sat so comfortably where nothing should exist. Sometimes, when I walk that street now, I slow down without meaning to, half expecting to see the stairs waiting for me again, and that feeling never really leaves. I didn't notice the crosswalk sign at first because it was already late, and my mind was focused on getting home before the rain picked up again, the kind of tired focus that narrows your world down to the next step and the next breath. It was just after midnight, the air cool and damp, and the street smelled faintly of wet concrete and car exhaust, a smell I had come to associate with long walks home and thoughts I didn't want to finish. I had missed the last bus by a few minutes, which felt intentional in a way I couldn't explain. I remember the night because it was raining in a way that felt tired, not heavy, just steady enough to make the streets shine and keep people indoors, and I was walking home later than usual because I had stayed longer at work to avoid going back to an empty apartment. It was close to midnight, and the city felt hollow, the kind of quiet where even distant sounds feel like they belong to someone else's life, and my shoes made soft, careful noises on the wet pavement that seemed too loud in the stillness. I took a shortcut I rarely used, a narrow street that cut behind a row of newer buildings, because I wanted to be home quickly, even though something about that street always made me walk a little faster than normal. The streetlights there were spaced too far apart, leaving long stretches of shadow between them, and I kept finding myself looking ahead instead of around me, like my body didn't want to notice too much. Halfway down the street, I slowed without meaning to, because I saw someone sitting ahead of me, right under one of the streetlights, and at first I felt relief because it meant I wasn't alone anymore. She was sitting on what looked like concrete stairs, elbows resting on her knees, head slightly bowed, completely still, and I assumed it was the entrance to a building I hadn't paid attention to before. As I got closer, I noticed she wasn't holding a phone or a bag or anything at all, just sitting there like she had been placed carefully and forgotten, and that small detail made me uneasy. I glanced around for the building behind her, expecting to see a doorway or at least a wall, but there was only empty space, a stretch of wet asphalt and darkness where a structure should have been. The countdown reached 1, and I waited for 0. It didn't change. The number stayed at 1, glowing steadily, the walking figure still lit, and the orange hand didn't appear, and I felt a faint tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with fear yet. I stopped in the middle of the crosswalk and looked up more directly, checking if maybe the angle had tricked me, but the display was clear and bright, still showing 1. I took another step, then another, telling myself the system was probably malfunctioning, that it would reset any second now. It didn't. The rain seemed quieter suddenly, or maybe I was just paying attention in a way I hadn't before, and the silence around the intersection felt stretched and thin. I reached the other side of the street and turned around, still watching the signal, and the number was still there, unchanged, like it had decided to stop moving altogether. I stood there longer than I should have, my hand resting on the strap of my bag, waiting for the countdown to finish what it had started. Cars passed in the distance, far enough away that their headlights felt unrelated to where I was standing, and the traffic lights for them stayed red. After a full minute, nothing had changed, and the number 1 felt less like a countdown and more like a statement. I told myself it didn't matter, that I had crossed safely, and I started walking again, trying to shake off the feeling that something small but important had gone wrong. Half a block later, curiosity pulled me back, and I glanced over my shoulder. The crosswalk sign was still showing 1. I stopped walking, my breath catching slightly, and I stood there watching it from a distance, the rain blurring the edges of the light but not the number itself. I checked my phone, partly to ground myself, partly to see how much time had passed, and it had only been 3 minutes since I crossed. When I looked up again, the number hadn't changed, and the walking figure was still lit, patiently inviting no one. I felt a quiet discomfort settle into me, not panic, just a growing sense that I shouldn't be paying this much attention to something so small. I turned fully back toward the intersection and started walking toward it, telling myself I wanted to see if the signal would change when I got closer. As I approached, the rain seemed to pick up slightly, or maybe the sound just felt louder now that my focus had narrowed. I stood beneath the sign again, directly below it this time, craning my neck to look up at the glowing display. The number 1 looked almost too bright against the dark sky, crisp and unwavering, and I noticed the faint hum of electricity coming from the pole. I waited. Nothing happened. I pressed the crosswalk button again, harder than before, and the button clicked, but the signal didn't react. The traffic lights for the cars stayed red, holding an empty intersection hostage, and the city felt oddly frozen around me. I became aware of how alone I was, standing there in the rain at an intersection that refused to finish its cycle, and that awareness made my skin prickle. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that technology fails all the time, and I stepped back into the crosswalk, just to see how it felt. The moment my foot touched the wet paint, the walking figure flickered slightly, and my heart jumped before I could stop it. The number stayed at 1. I crossed halfway again, slower this time, listening to my own footsteps and the distant hum of the city that felt farther away than it should have. In the middle of the road, I stopped and looked around, and the streetlights seemed dimmer somehow, their light pooling instead of spreading. I stood there, caught between both sides of the street, and felt a strange hesitation, like moving forward or backward required a decision I didn't understand. I forced myself to finish crossing, my pace quickening, and when I reached the sidewalk, I didn't turn around right away. When I finally did, the number was still there, still 1, still glowing patiently in the rain. I noticed then that no other lights at the intersection had changed, as if time had slowed specifically for that crossing. I waited longer this time, counting my own seconds in my head, trying to see if they matched what I was seeing. They didn't. After what felt like 5 full minutes, nothing had shifted, and my sense of unease deepened into something heavier and harder to ignore. I wondered how long it had been like that, whether it had stopped counting down before I arrived, or if it had chosen that moment specifically. The thought made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain, like I was giving intention to something that shouldn't have one. I started walking away again, faster now, my shoulders tense, the rain soaking through my jacket without me noticing. The city moved on, but the number stayed there, glowing steadily, like it had the night I first saw it. I stepped back from the curb and walked away slowly, my heart heavy, knowing that whatever was happening didn't need me to understand it. Now, whenever I cross a street at night and see the numbers counting down, I feel a faint tension in my chest until they reach 0. And sometimes, when I'm walking alone and the rain is just right, I swear I can feel an intersection somewhere behind me, still waiting, still counting down to something it never intends to reach. The first thing I noticed that night was how quiet everything felt, not silent exactly, just muted, like the city had turned its volume down without telling anyone, and I remember thinking it made my own movements feel too loud. It was a little past midnight, maybe closer to 1, and the rain had just stopped, leaving the streets dark and reflective, the air cool enough to raise goosebumps on my arms whenever a breeze passed. I was walking home from a friend's place because I needed the walk to clear my head, even though it meant taking the longer route through streets that were mostly empty at that hour. My shoes made a soft, steady sound against the pavement, damp but not slippery, and that rhythm felt comforting at first, like proof that I was moving forward and everything was normal. The streetlights were spaced far apart, creating long stretches of shadow between pools of yellow light, and I found myself timing my steps to reach each one a little faster. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just letting my thoughts drift, when I became aware of another sound layered over my own footsteps. At first, I assumed it was an echo, the kind that happens when buildings are close together and the ground is wet, so I didn't pay much attention to it. The sound was faint but clear, another set of footsteps landing just after mine, close enough that I could feel it more than hear it. I slowed slightly, curious, and the sound slowed with me, which felt strange but still easy to explain away. I told myself someone must be walking behind me, matching my pace without realizing it, and that thought should have been enough to settle my nerves. But when I glanced back over my shoulder, the street behind me was empty, stretching out into darkness with no movement at all. I stopped walking completely, holding my breath without meaning to, and the footsteps stopped too, leaving the quiet heavier than before. I stood there for a few seconds, listening hard, and the only sounds were distant traffic and the faint hum of a streetlight above me. I laughed quietly at myself, embarrassed by how quickly my imagination had reacted, and started walking again, trying to shake off the tension. The footsteps returned immediately, landing right after mine, close enough that it felt intentional, and my chest tightened before I could stop it. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, that sound travels strangely at night, especially after rain, and I focused on keeping my pace steady. Step after step, the sound followed, not faster, not slower, always just behind, always close enough to feel like it belonged to me. I changed my pace suddenly, taking shorter steps, then longer ones, and the sound adjusted perfectly, matching me without delay. My mouth felt dry, and I became painfully aware of how alone I was on that street, with no cars passing and no windows lit. I stopped again, my heart pounding now, and the footsteps stopped at the exact same moment, leaving the air thick and waiting. I turned around fully this time, scanning the street more carefully, and there was still no one there, no movement, no shadow out of place. The space behind me felt too open, too empty, and I felt exposed standing there in the middle of the sidewalk. I started walking again, faster now, my steps sharper against the pavement, and the footsteps followed instantly, just as fast, just as sharp. I could hear the slight scrape of a sole against concrete, the same sound my own shoes made, and that similarity made my stomach twist. I told myself to stay calm, to keep walking toward the brighter main road ahead, even though it felt farther away than it should have. The rainwater on the ground reflected the streetlights, and the moving reflections made it feel like the ground itself was shifting beneath me. With every step, the sound stayed with me, close and precise, like a shadow that refused to fall behind. I tried listening for any difference, any detail that might separate the sound from my own, but there was none. It matched me perfectly, right down to the slight hesitation in my left step where my shoe always felt a bit loose. That was the moment fear settled fully into my chest, slow and heavy, because it felt personal in a way I couldn't explain. I crossed the street suddenly without warning myself, hoping the sound would lag or change. But it crossed with me, seamless and immediate. The intersection was empty, the traffic lights cycling pointlessly, and my footsteps echoed louder in the open space. I stopped in the middle of the crosswalk, my breath coming shallow, and the footsteps stopped too, exactly where I stopped. The silence pressed in from all sides, and I felt like I was being watched by the night itself. I told myself to turn around, to confront whoever was behind me, but my body refused to move for a few seconds too long. When I finally turned, my heart racing, there was still nothing there, just empty asphalt and rain-slicked pavement. The realization that there was no one to confront made my fear sharper, more focused, and harder to control. I walked again, forcing my legs to move even though they felt weak, and the footsteps followed, patient and close. I became aware of how carefully they matched me, not just in timing but in weight, in rhythm, like they knew exactly how I moved. My thoughts started spiraling, jumping to explanations that felt less and less reasonable, and none of them made me feel better. I wondered if I was hearing my own footsteps delayed somehow, if my mind was creating a second sound to fill the quiet. But that didn't explain why they stopped when I stopped, or why they changed when I did. The street narrowed ahead, leading into a long alley I usually avoided at night, and I hesitated, not wanting to enter a more enclosed space. Behind me, the footsteps waited with me, silent but present, and that patience felt unsettling. I took a few tentative steps into the alley, telling myself I needed to keep moving, and the sound followed immediately. The walls on either side were close, brick damp from the rain, and my footsteps echoed more strongly now. The matching footsteps echoed too, blending with mine until it felt like the alley itself was walking with me. I slowed again, then stopped, and the sound stopped, leaving a ringing silence that made my ears ache. I leaned against the wall, my breathing loud in the narrow space, and tried to steady myself. I told myself to listen carefully, to separate what I was hearing from what I feared, but the quiet offered no answers. When I pushed off the wall and started walking again, the footsteps returned, close enough that I felt them more than heard them. I resisted the urge to run, afraid that if I did, whatever was following would run too. Instead, I focused on reaching the end of the alley, where I knew the street opened up again. The distance felt longer than usual, each step stretching out, the sound behind me never faltering. I reached the end and stepped into the open street, my heart pounding, and for a brief moment I hoped the sound would disappear. It didn't. The street here was wider, with a few parked cars and one flickering streetlight, and the openness made the footsteps feel even more exposed. I stopped beside one of the cars and bent down as if to tie my shoe, wanting to test something. The footsteps stopped too, right behind me, close enough that I felt a strange pressure in the air. I stayed there for a few seconds, my hands shaking, then stood up quickly and turned around. There was no one there, no reflection in the car windows, no shadow that didn't belong. The space behind me felt occupied anyway, like something had just stepped back. I walked faster now, my pace bordering on a run, and the footsteps matched me perfectly, never gaining, never falling behind. My breathing grew loud, uneven, and I could hear it mixing with the sound of my steps and the other steps, all of it blending together. I told myself I was almost home, that once I reached my building, this would stop making sense. The street leading to my apartment was quieter than the rest, lined with trees that blocked some of the light. As I turned onto it, the darkness felt thicker, and the footsteps followed me into it without hesitation. I slowed near my building, my chest tight, afraid of what might happen when I stopped completely. I stopped anyway, standing at the edge of the sidewalk, and the footsteps stopped with me, closer than they had ever been. I stood there for a long moment, not turning around, not moving, just listening to the sound of my own heart. The air felt heavy against my back, like someone standing just behind me, waiting. Slowly, carefully, I took one step forward, and the footsteps took one step with me. I reached the door of my building and unlocked it with shaking hands, the sound of the key too loud in the quiet. When I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt sudden and wrong. I stood there in the dim hallway, listening, waiting for the sound to continue on the other side of the door. It didn't. I went up to my apartment and locked the door, then stood just inside it for a long time, my ear pressed close, listening for any sound. There was nothing, just the faint hum of the building and my own breathing. I told myself it was over, that whatever I had experienced was tied to being outside, to the empty streets and my tired mind. But later that night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I shifted my legs slightly under the blanket. From somewhere close, I heard the soft sound of fabric moving at the exact same time. I stayed very still after that, staring into the dark, listening, and wondering how close matching footsteps could really get without being seen. I noticed her standing across the street before I noticed the sky, which felt normal at the time because it was late and I was tired and my attention was drifting the way it does when you've been walking alone too long. It was just after midnight, the hour when the city seems undecided about whether to sleep or stay awake, and the air was cool enough to carry the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. I had taken the longer route home again, partly to clear my head and partly because the streets were quieter there, the kind of quiet that makes your footsteps feel like they belong to someone else. The clouds were low and slow, stretched thin across the sky, moving just enough to be noticeable if you stared at them, and I remember thinking they looked heavy without looking dangerous. She stood near a bus stop that hadn't seen a bus in hours, hands in her coat pockets, head tilted back slightly, like she was waiting for something to happen above her. At first, I assumed she was just watching the weather, the way people do when they sense rain coming, and I didn't think much of it. As I got closer, I noticed she hadn't moved at all, not even to shift her weight, and that stillness made me slow down without realizing it. The streetlight beside her flickered once, briefly, and the light caught her face in a way that made it hard to tell how old she was, which felt unsettling. She didn't look at me when I passed, didn't acknowledge my presence, just kept staring upward, eyes fixed on the sky with quiet focus. I walked a few steps beyond her and then stopped, because something about her posture made me curious in a way I didn't like. I told myself I was just being observant, that it was normal to notice small things when you're alone at night, but my chest felt tight anyway. I turned slightly, pretending to check my phone, and glanced back at her, and she was still looking up, completely absorbed. That was when I followed triggering curiosity got the better of me, and I followed her gaze up into the sky, feeling vaguely foolish as I did. The clouds were moving slowly from west to east, thin layers sliding over one another, their edges soft and uneven. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just shifting shapes that meant nothing, and I almost looked away. Then I noticed a familiar curve in one of the darker breaks between the clouds, a shape that felt too deliberate to ignore. I stared longer, my eyes adjusting, my mind trying to decide whether it was coincidence or pattern. The curve became a letter, not sharp or clear, but recognizable enough that my breath caught before I could stop it. I told myself it was nothing, that clouds form random shapes all the time, and that my brain was simply filling in gaps. But as I kept watching, more spaces between the clouds lined up, forming the next letter with quiet patience. The wind didn't change, and the clouds didn't speed up, but the shapes seemed to settle into place anyway. Which felt wrong. I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, like the beginning of a headache, and I lowered my gaze for a second just to break the moment. When I looked back up, the letters were still there, clearer now, arranged in a way that made my stomach drop. They spelled my name. Not a nickname, not something similar, but my full name, stretched across the sky in uneven, drifting shapes that should not have meant anything. I felt a sudden heat rise in my face, followed by a cold sensation in my hands, and I became aware of how fast my heart was beating. I told myself there had to be another explanation, that I was projecting meaning where none existed, because the alternative felt too uncomfortable to consider. I looked around quickly, half expecting to see someone watching me, laughing quietly at some elaborate trick, but the street was empty. The woman still hadn't moved, still staring upward, and the realization that she might be seeing the same thing made my throat feel dry. I took a small step toward her, unsure why, and cleared my throat softly, the sound seeming too loud in the open space. She didn't react, didn't blink or shift, just continued looking at the sky as if she had all the time in the world. I wanted to ask her what she saw, to confirm whether this was real or just happening in my head, but the words felt stuck. Instead, I looked back up, forcing myself to examine the shapes more critically, searching for flaws in the pattern. The letters wavered slightly as the clouds moved, but they didn't fall apart, and that persistence made me uneasy. I noticed then that the clouds around the letters seemed thinner, as if the sky itself was making space for them. My name felt unfamiliar suddenly, like something I was seeing for the first time from a distance. I thought about how many people in the world shared my name, how common it was, and tried to convince myself it didn't mean me. But the thought didn't settle, and the sense of being noticed pressed in harder. The woman finally moved, lowering her head slowly, and for a brief moment I hoped she would look at me. She didn't. Instead, she turned and walked away down the street, her steps unhurried, her expression calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. I watched her go, torn between following her and staying exactly where I was, and neither option felt right. When I looked back up at the sky, the letters were already beginning to blur, the shapes stretching and dissolving. Relief washed over me too quickly, sharp and incomplete, like I was celebrating something I didn't understand. Within moments, the clouds were just clouds again, drifting without meaning, and the sky looked ordinary. I stood there longer than I should have, my neck aching slightly, waiting for something else to appear. Nothing did. Eventually, I forced myself to keep walking, my steps slower now, my thoughts looping back to the same image again and again. Every few seconds, I glanced up, half expecting my name to reassemble itself above me. The rest of the walk home felt stretched, like time had softened, and every sound seemed distant. When I reached my apartment, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the clouds pass silently overhead. They never formed words again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were capable of it. Sometimes now, when I'm walking alone at night and someone nearby stops to look up at the sky, I feel a quiet tension settle into my chest. I don't look up with them anymore, because I'm not sure what would feel worse, seeing my name again, or realizing it had been waiting for me to notice all along. The night I remember most clearly didn't feel important while I was living it, which is probably why it stayed with me so deeply afterward. It was late, close to 1 in the morning, and the air had that damp, metallic smell that comes after a light rain, when the streets look freshly washed but still uneasy. I was waiting for the last bus home, standing alone at a stop I'd used for years, the plastic bench wet and cold beneath my hand as I leaned against the shelter. The street was quiet in a tired way, like it had given up on expecting anything new. The bus was already late, which didn't surprise me, but I kept checking the road anyway, watching reflections ripple across the asphalt under the streetlights. My phone screen lit my face in pale blue every time I checked the time, and each minute felt heavier than the last. When the bus finally appeared, its headlights cutting slowly through the darkness, I felt that familiar relief settle in my chest, the simple comfort of knowing I wouldn't have to walk the rest of the way home. It pulled up with a soft hiss of brakes, water spraying lightly from the curb, and the engine idled with a low, patient hum that felt reassuring. The doors opened. At first, nothing seemed wrong, and I stepped closer out of habit, reaching for my transit card without really looking inside. Then I looked up. The bus interior wasn't lit the way it should have been. Instead of the usual harsh white lights and rows of empty seats, I saw warm, yellow light spilling out, soft and uneven, like lamplight. I hesitated, my foot hovering just above the first step, my hand tightening around my card. Inside the bus was my old living room. Not a version of it. Not something similar, but exactly as it had been years ago, down to the small crack in the wall near the corner and the faded rug that never quite lay flat. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing, and I felt that hollow, floating sensation you get when something is too wrong to accept. The couch sat where it always had, worn and familiar, with the armrest slightly darker from years of use. The lamp beside it was on, its shade tilted just a little to the left like it always had been. I could see the hallway beyond, narrow and dim, leading deeper into the space where bedrooms used to be. The bus driver didn't speak. He sat behind the wheel like normal, his face half-lit, staring straight ahead as if nothing about this was unusual. I stood there longer than I should have, rain lightly misting my jacket, my heart beginning to beat harder with each second that passed. I told myself there had to be a reflection, some kind of visual trick, but the smell drifting out wasn't diesel or wet rubber. It was old wood, dust, and something faintly sweet I remembered from childhood. The smell of my old home. People talk about memories hitting you suddenly, but this felt different. It wasn't a memory. It felt present, solid, waiting. "Are you getting on?" the driver finally said, his voice calm, almost bored, like he asked that question every night. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out at first. My throat felt tight, dry. I think this is the wrong bus," I managed to say, even though the route number glowing on the front was correct. The driver didn't turn his head. "Last stop," he replied quietly. Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist, like he wasn't talking about the route at all. I looked inside again, my eyes drifting across the familiar details I hadn't thought about in years. The small table near the couch still had a faint ring where a mug had once been left too long. The picture frame on the wall was slightly crooked, just like I remembered. I felt a strange pull in my chest, a mix of longing and dread, like seeing someone you miss but know you shouldn't talk to again. Behind me, the street was empty. No cars passed. No footsteps echoed. It felt like the world had narrowed to just me and the open door. "Come on," the driver said gently now, and for the first time, that frightened me more than anything else. I stepped back instead of forward, my shoe scraping softly against the wet pavement. The bus didn't move. The doors stayed open. The light inside remained steady. I realized then that the house looked lived in, not frozen in time. The lamp flickered slightly, like it always did. Somewhere deeper inside, I thought I heard a soft sound, maybe a floorboard settling, or something shifting in another room. My chest tightened. I shook my head, more to myself than anyone else, and took another step back. The driver sighed quietly, a sound filled with something like disappointment. The doors began to close slowly, but as they did, I caught one last glimpse inside. The hallway light was on now. It hadn't been before. The bus pulled away without another sound, tires rolling softly over wet pavement, disappearing down the street like nothing unusual had happened at all. I stood there long after it was gone, the rain slowly soaking through my jacket, my heart still racing. When I finally looked down the road again, the street felt wrong, like something had been removed and the space hadn't settled yet. I walked home instead, every step heavy, replaying the scene in my mind and trying to find a version of it that made sense. That night, I dreamed of walking through my old home, room by room, turning on lights that didn't respond the way they should. Since then, I avoid taking the bus late at night, even when it's inconvenient. But sometimes, when I pass a bus stopped at a light and glance inside, I feel a brief, sharp fear that I'll see warm yellow light where it doesn't belong. And I wonder if that bus still runs its route, doors opening quietly for someone who's tired enough to step inside without thinking. I didn't even register the mirror at first because it blended into the street the way forgotten things often do, leaning between a closed tailor shop and a narrow alley, its surface dull under the streetlight like it had been there longer than anyone remembered. It was late, well past midnight, and the air was cool enough to sting slightly in my lungs, carrying the faint smell of rain that had already passed through and left the pavement dark and glossy. I was walking home alone, hands in my pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, my mind drifting between unfinished thoughts and the steady rhythm of my steps. The street was nearly empty, just the distant sound of a car somewhere far away and the soft hum of electricity from the streetlights overhead, and that quiet felt comforting in a tired way. When I passed the mirror, I only noticed it because of movement, a flicker of motion that didn't match my own, and that made my eyes shift before I could stop myself. I slowed, then stopped, standing a few steps beyond it, and turned back to look, feeling faintly embarrassed at how quickly my attention had been caught. The mirror was tall, taller than me, its frame old and chipped, the glass slightly clouded like it hadn't been cleaned in years, and it looked completely out of place on the sidewalk. I stepped closer, expecting to see my reflection standing there in my dark jacket and worn shoes, looking tired and unremarkable. Instead, the person in the mirror was dressed differently. For a moment, I thought the angle was wrong, or the light was playing tricks on the glass, but the longer I looked, the more obvious it became. The reflection wore a lighter coat than mine, neatly buttoned, the fabric smooth and unfamiliar, and the shoes were cleaner, polished in a way mine hadn't been in a long time. My posture was the same, my face unmistakably mine, but the clothes were wrong, subtly but undeniably. I looked down at myself, at the dark jacket hanging open, at the scuffed shoes, then back up at the mirror, and the difference remained. A quiet confusion settled in, not fear yet, just the unsettling sense that something wasn't lining up the way it should. I lifted one hand slowly, testing it, and the reflection did the same, the sleeve of the lighter coat moving smoothly with the motion. The gesture matched perfectly, but the fabric didn't, and that mismatch made my stomach tighten. I told myself it had to be a trick of reflection, maybe another mirror somewhere, or glass layered in a way I didn't understand, and I leaned closer. Up close, I could see the same faint scar near my eyebrow, the same tired lines around my eyes, details that felt too personal to be coincidence. The reflection blinked when I blinked, breathed when I breathed, but it wore clothes I did not own. The street around me stayed quiet, the world continuing on without noticing what I was seeing, and that made the moment feel oddly private. I stepped to the side, then back again, and the reflection mirrored me perfectly, always dressed that other way, like it was a version of me paused at a different point. A strange thought crossed my mind then, uncomfortable and uninvited, that the clothes in the mirror looked like something I used to wear. Not exactly, but close enough to stir a dull ache of recognition, like remembering a room you haven't been in for years. I straightened slightly, and the reflection straightened too, looking more composed than I felt, and that difference bothered me more than the clothes. I took a step back, breaking eye contact, my heart beating a little faster now, and the reflection did the same, retreating in perfect sync. The mirror didn't change, didn't flicker or distort, just stayed steady, patient, waiting. I glanced around the street, half expecting someone else to be watching, but there was no one, no movement beyond the slow drift of clouds overhead. I told myself to keep walking, that stopping here was unnecessary, that mirrors didn't mean anything, especially ones left outside like forgotten furniture. I turned away and took a few steps forward, my footsteps sounding louder than before. After a moment, curiosity pulled me back, and I looked over my shoulder. The reflection was still there, still dressed differently, still standing where I had been, watching me with my own eyes. I stopped again, frustration mixing with unease, and turned fully back toward the mirror. This time, I noticed something else. The reflection's clothes looked dry. My jacket felt slightly damp from the earlier rain, the fabric heavy against my arms. But the lighter coat in the mirror showed no sign of moisture at all. That detail lodged itself in my chest, small but sharp, and I felt a faint chill that had nothing to do with the night air. I stepped closer again, my breath fogging faintly in front of me, and the reflection did the same, its breath fogging the glass from the other side. The fog cleared, and the face staring back at me looked calm in a way I didn't feel. I leaned in slightly, my nose almost touching the glass, and I searched my own eyes for something different, something wrong. For just a second, I thought the reflection hesitated, like it had almost moved before I did, and my heart jumped. But then it matched me again, perfect and precise, and I couldn't tell if I'd imagined the delay. The streetlight above flickered once, briefly dimming, and the mirror darkened for a heartbeat. When the light steadied, the reflection was still there. The clothes were still wrong. I felt suddenly tired, the kind of tired that makes you careless, and I wondered how long I'd been standing there. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me, and I pulled it out quickly, grateful for the interruption. There were no new messages, just a low battery warning, and the time glowed back at me later than I expected. When I looked up again, the reflection hadn't changed, but the longer I stared, the more it felt like it was staring back with intention. I lifted my hand again, slower this time, and the reflection lifted its hand too, the lighter sleeve moving smoothly. I lowered my hand, and it followed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had known what I was going to do before I did it. The thought made my skin prickle, and I stepped back abruptly, almost tripping on the uneven pavement. The reflection stepped back too, stopping exactly where I stopped, maintaining the same distance. I turned sharply and started walking away, my pace quickening despite my efforts to stay calm. I told myself not to look back, that looking back would only make this feel more real than it needed to be. After half a block, I glanced back anyway. The mirror was still there, smaller now in the distance, and even from that far away, I could see the lighter shape of the other outfit inside it. I walked faster, my thoughts looping, trying to find a reasonable explanation, but none of them settled. The rest of the walk home felt stretched and thin, every reflection in dark windows making my chest tighten briefly before I realized it was normal. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the quiet. Inside, I went straight to the bathroom and turned on the light, facing the mirror above the sink. My reflection looked normal, dressed exactly as I was, damp jacket and all, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Still, I studied myself longer than usual, checking angles, lighting, my expression, waiting for something to shift. Nothing did. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept thinking about the clothes in the street mirror, about how familiar they had felt without being mine. I wondered where that mirror came from, who put it there, and how long it had been waiting. In the days since, I've taken different routes home, avoiding that street without fully admitting why. But sometimes, when I pass a dark window or a reflective surface late at night, I catch myself glancing just a little too carefully. And every now and then, I feel a quiet, unsettling certainty that somewhere out there, a mirror is still standing, showing a version of me dressed for a moment I haven't reached yet. I remember the receipt more clearly than the purchase, which feels backwards now, but that's how the night settled into my memory, uneven and slightly out of order, like something I wasn't meant to keep straight. It was raining in that quiet, steady way that makes streets feel emptied on purpose, and it had been raining long enough that the gutters whispered constantly, as if the city was talking to itself while everyone else stayed indoors. I was walking home later than usual, past midnight, my jacket damp at the shoulders, my hands cold in my pockets, taking a route I didn't normally use because I wanted movement more than familiarity. The streetlights were spaced far apart, leaving long stretches of shadow where the rain seemed darker, and my footsteps echoed softly in a way that made me feel more alone than I expected. I wasn't looking for a store, which feels important now, because nothing about that night felt planned, and I hadn't needed to buy anything in particular. I only noticed the storefront because of the light. It was warm and yellow, spilling gently onto the sidewalk, cutting through the blue-gray of the rain, and it made everything around it look slightly softer, more inviting than the rest of the street. The sign above the window was plain, unlit, and unremarkable, just a name printed in simple lettering that didn't stick in my mind, even though I tried to remember it later. Inside, the shelves looked sparsely stocked, not empty but not busy either, and something about that felt comforting, like a place that didn't expect customers often. I stood outside for a moment longer than necessary, watching rain slide down the glass, listening to the faint hum coming from inside, and wondering why a store would be open so late on such a quiet street. Eventually, I pushed the door open, and a small bell rang, the sound dull and tired, like it had been rung too many times before. The air inside was warmer, drier, and it smelled faintly of cardboard and something sweet I couldn't place, which made me relax without realizing it. There was only one other person inside. She stood behind the counter, hands folded, looking down at something I couldn't see, and she didn't look up right away when I entered, which made the space feel oddly calm. I walked slowly between the shelves, pretending to browse, even though my attention drifted more toward the quiet than the items themselves, which all seemed ordinary in a way that didn't invite closer inspection. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second clear and isolated, and I remember thinking how loud time sounded in that room. I picked up a small item near the counter, something cheap and forgettable, mostly because it felt strange to be inside without buying anything at all. When I approached the counter, she looked up. Her face was neutral, not unfriendly, not welcoming, just present, and her eyes met mine in a way that made me feel briefly like I was interrupting something. She rang up the item without speaking, the register making a soft electronic sound that felt too loud in the quiet store. I paid in cash, noticing how clean the bills looked under the counter light, and she counted the change carefully, placing it in my hand without our fingers touching. Then she printed the receipt. The printer whirred longer than I expected, the paper feeding out slowly, and the sound seemed to stretch, making me suddenly aware of how still everything else was. She tore it cleanly and handed it to me, her fingers brushing mine just slightly this time, cold in a way that lingered longer than it should have. "Have a good night," she said softly, her voice calm and flat, like the words were routine but not personal. I nodded, thanked her, and turned toward the door, the bell ringing again as I stepped back into the rain. The warmth vanished immediately, replaced by the damp chill, and the street felt darker now that I was back outside, like the light behind me had been holding something back. I walked a few steps away before unfolding the receipt, curious in that idle way you are when there's nothing else to focus on. The paper felt thinner than usual, almost delicate, and the ink looked slightly faded, as if it hadn't fully settled into the fibers. I scanned it casually at first, checking the price, the time, the date, and that's when I slowed down. The store name at the top didn't look right. It wasn't misspelled, exactly, but it didn't feel familiar either, even though I had just been standing beneath its sign moments ago. The address listed underneath made my stomach tighten. It was the street I was on, but the number didn't make sense, positioned between two buildings I knew well enough to know there was nothing in between them. I stopped walking, rain soaking into my shoes, and looked back toward where the store should have been. The street behind me was empty. There was no light, no window, no open door, just a long stretch of brick walls and darkened facades reflecting the rain. I told myself I must have turned onto a different street without realizing it, that my sense of direction had slipped, and I started walking back slowly, scanning both sides carefully. There was no storefront. Where the light had been, there was only a blank wall, damp and dark, with a closed business further down and an alley where the warmth should have spilled out. I stood there longer than I should have, rain running down my face, my hand still holding the receipt, my heart beating harder with each passing second. I checked the address again, then looked at the buildings, then back at the receipt, caught in a loop that didn't resolve anything. No sign of a door. No mark on the sidewalk. No smell of warmth. Just rain and silence. I walked the block twice, then a third time, slower each pass, looking for anything I might have missed, but the street remained unchanged, stubbornly ordinary. Eventually, I convinced myself that exhaustion was playing tricks on me, that I had stepped into a store on a nearby street and merged the memories without realizing it. That explanation felt thin, but it was the only one that allowed me to keep moving. When I got home, I placed the receipt on my table and went straight to the bathroom, staring at my reflection longer than necessary, checking my eyes, my expression, grounding myself in something solid. The receipt was still there when I came back. Under the light of my apartment, the ink looked even fainter, and the paper seemed older somehow, like it had been folded and unfolded many times before. The time printed on it was wrong. It showed a time nearly 40 minutes earlier than when I knew I had entered the store, and I couldn't find a way to explain that without feeling uneasy. I kept the receipt, slipping it into a drawer instead of throwing it away, telling myself I would look into it later when my head was clearer. The next day, I walked the street again in daylight. There was no store. No sign of renovation. No empty space where one could have been. The buildings stood tightly together, unchanged, and the alley I'd noticed the night before was just an alley, smelling faintly of trash and damp stone. I checked online maps, old directories, even city records, searching for the store name printed on the receipt. Nothing came up. Not a review. Not a mention. Not even an outdated listing. Days passed, and I thought about it less, though not because it bothered me less, but because thinking about it felt like touching something fragile that might break if I pressed too hard. Sometimes, when it rains at night, I take different routes home without planning to, my feet turning away from that street before I consciously decide. The receipt is still in my drawer. The paper has yellowed slightly, and the ink is fading more each time I look at it, like it's slowly forgetting itself. Every now and then, when the apartment is quiet and the rain is steady, I take it out and read it again, half expecting the address to have changed. It never does. And sometimes I wonder if the store existed only for the time it took me to walk through its door, or if it's still there somewhere, light on, waiting to hand a receipt to someone else who won't know where it came from either. I noticed the map because it wouldn't stay flat, even when I pressed it down with both hands, the paper springing up at the corners as if it had a memory of being folded a different way. It was late, well past midnight, and the rain had thinned into a fine mist that clung to my jacket and hair without ever fully falling, making the streetlights glow softly like they were underwater. I had taken the map from a rack at the metro exit earlier that evening, one of those free city maps printed on thin paper, already creased from too many hands, and I told myself I only needed it because my phone battery was low. The streets around me were unfamiliar, quieter than they should have been for a city this size, and each block felt slightly longer than the last, as if distance itself had decided to stretch. I stopped beneath a flickering lamp and unfolded the map again, smoothing it against my thigh, tracing my finger along the printed roads while listening to the distant sound of traffic that never seemed to get closer. The layout made sense at first. The main road ran straight, the side streets branched off at clean angles, and the small square marked near my location gave me something solid to aim for. I folded the map carefully along the existing creases, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and continued walking, counting my steps without realizing it, just to feel like time was moving normally. After a few minutes, I reached an intersection that didn't match what I remembered seeing on the map. The street name was right, the sign clear and freshly painted, but the crossing itself was wrong. Wider than it should have been, with an extra lane that wasn't marked anywhere. I took the map out again. As I unfolded it, the paper resisted, shifting slightly under my fingers, and for a moment I thought the wind was catching it, even though the air was completely still. The square near my location was no longer square. It had stretched into a narrow rectangle, and one of the side streets now curved gently instead of meeting the main road at a right angle. I told myself maps were simplified representations, that streets curve in reality more than they do on paper, and that I was overthinking something ordinary because it was late and I was tired. I refolded the map, more carefully this time, aligning the creases so precisely that it felt like an unnecessary act of control. As soon as I started walking again, I felt that quiet unease return, the kind that sits just behind your thoughts and waits for you to notice it. The rain misted my face, cool and constant, and my footsteps sounded too loud on the pavement, echoing in a way that suggested empty spaces I couldn't see. When I reached what should have been the small square, there was no square at all. Instead, the road narrowed abruptly, buildings leaning inward on both sides, their windows dark and unreflective, swallowing the streetlight rather than bouncing it back. I stood there for a long moment, listening. No voices. No engines. Not even the sound of wind. Just the soft hiss of moisture settling on concrete. I unfolded the map again, my fingers already tense before I touched the paper. The layout had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that screamed for attention, but subtly enough to make me doubt my memory. The narrow street was now printed clearly, labeled with a name I didn't recognize, and the square had shifted several blocks east, as if it had always been there. I stared at the map longer than necessary, trying to remember what it had looked like the first time, but the earlier version felt fuzzy, like a dream you can't fully recall once you're awake. I laughed quietly, just once, the sound thin and quickly swallowed by the empty street, and folded the map again, telling myself I was letting the dark get to me. As I walked, I kept one hand in my pocket, fingers touching the folded paper, reassured by its presence even though I didn't fully trust it anymore. The streets grew more repetitive the farther I went. Same height buildings. Same closed shops. Same unlit windows. It felt like walking through variations of the same block, rearranged slightly each time. I stopped again, unfolding the map under a streetlight that buzzed faintly above me. This time, I watched it closely as I opened it. The paper shifted on its own. Not fast, not dramatically, but enough that I saw the lines realign, roads bending, intersections sliding into new positions with a dry, whispering sound. My breath caught before I could stop it. The map settled into a new shape, and when it did, the layout matched the street I was standing on perfectly, down to the narrowness and the lack of side exits. I folded it quickly, heart beating harder now, my hands trembling just enough to make the paper crackle loudly in the quiet. I told myself it was a trick of perception, that the movement had been in my hands, not the map. And that fear was filling in the gaps. Still, I didn't unfold it again for a while. I walked faster, my pace uneven, shoes slapping softly against the wet pavement, every shadow ahead feeling deeper than it should have been. When I reached a dead end, I stopped so suddenly that my shoulder brushed the brick wall in front of me, the cold seeping through my jacket. The street simply ended. No turn. No alley. Just a wall, damp and stained, with a single faded poster peeling away near the ground. I pulled the map out again. As I unfolded it, I didn't look at the layout right away. I watched the paper. The creases loosened. The edges curled inward. The printed street slid, overlapping briefly before settling into a new configuration that included the dead end as if it had always been there. My location marker sat calmly at the end of the road, a small dot that felt almost mocking in its certainty. I felt a strange pressure in my chest then, not panic exactly, but a heavy awareness that something was wrong in a quiet, methodical way. I folded the map slowly, deliberately, aligning the edges with care, as if treating it gently might keep it still. When I turned around, the street behind me looked longer than it had before, stretching away into darkness that the streetlights didn't quite reach. I walked back the way I came, resisting the urge to run, telling myself that running would only make this feel worse. After a few minutes, I unfolded the map again. The dead end was gone. The street now curved gently into a wider road that I could see ahead of me, its outline matching the printed lines with uncomfortable precision. I stopped unfolding the map after that. I kept walking, choosing turns at random, trusting my instincts more than the paper, even though my instincts felt less reliable with every step. Time started to feel strange. My watch said only 15 minutes had passed, but my legs ached as if I'd been walking for hours. The rain never fully stopped, never fully fell, existing in that in-between state that makes it hard to remember when it started. Eventually, I recognized a landmark. A cafe with a distinctive green awning, closed now but familiar enough to make my chest loosen slightly. I didn't check the map. I didn't slow down. I walked past it, then another block, until the streets opened up and traffic sounds returned, distant but real. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, listening to my own breathing in the sudden, solid quiet. The map sat heavy in my pocket. I didn't unfold it right away. When I finally did, hours later, under the steady light of my kitchen, it showed the city exactly as I remembered it, neat and logical, every street in its proper place. The creases were different. New folds ran through areas I knew I hadn't touched before, as if the map had been folded and refolded while I wasn't looking. I folded it once more, carefully, and placed it in a drawer, telling myself I wouldn't use it again. Sometimes, late at night, when rain taps softly against the windows and the city feels slightly out of alignment, I think about that map resting in the dark, folded in a shape I don't remember giving it, waiting quietly to decide where things belong next. I first noticed it when I reached the corner near the old pharmacy, the one with the flickering neon sign that buzzed softly in the damp night air. I glanced at my watch, the one I always wore, and saw it was 12:17 a.m. Nothing unusual, except that I had the strange, inexplicable feeling that something was slightly off. The street was empty, rain misting the asphalt, reflecting the faint light of the few functioning street lamps, and every sound, my shoes against the wet pavement. The distant drip of water from a roof seemed unnaturally loud. I kept walking, my jacket damp from the drizzle, and reached a cafe that was closed but still lit by a single yellow bulb over the door. Out of habit, I checked the digital clock on the wall above the entrance. 12:21 a.m. I frowned, glancing down at my wrist again. 12:17, I shook my head and laughed softly to myself, thinking I had misread it earlier. A few steps later, I passed a small newsstand with an analog clock mounted crookedly above it. The hands pointed 11:59. My heart skipped slightly. I stopped, staring at it, feeling a tightness in my chest, and then looked back at my watch. Still 12:17. The cafe clock had moved to 12:22. I tried to breathe normally, telling myself I was imagining things. It had to be a coincidence, a trick of my mind in the quiet of the night. The street narrowed ahead, wet cobblestones glistening under the dim glow of the street lamps. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and checked the time again, first my watch, then the clocks embedded in nearby buildings. Each one showed something different: 12:05, 12:31, 11:50. Even the small car dashboard clocks visible through windows reflected inconsistent times. I stopped walking completely, suddenly aware of how alone I was. A breeze stirred, carrying the smell of wet concrete and something faintly metallic, and I realized I hadn't seen another person in minutes. My instincts told me to keep moving, but curiosity, and a growing unease, made me pause. I looked up at the pharmacy sign again. 12:26, I lowered my eyes to my watch. 12:17, the newsstand clock, still 11:59, ticked silently in defiance of reason. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the clocks were broken, I thought. But every clock, digital, analog, big and small, none of them in sync. And the way the numbers shifted subtly as I moved from one side of the street to the other felt deliberate, like the city itself was bending time around me. The drizzle became steadier, tiny rivulets running down the curb. I checked my phone. 12:18, only a minute had passed since my first glance, though it felt longer. I looked back down the street. A neon sign in the distance flickered. 12:55, I swallowed, the pit in my stomach growing heavier. Each time I looked up, each time I shifted my gaze, the numbers danced, refusing to align. I kept moving, slowly, my steps hesitant. Every familiar landmark now seemed unfamiliar, distorted by the inconsistency of the clocks. The corner that used to lead toward my apartment now opened into a stretch I didn't recognize, the streetlights spaced unevenly, some buzzing, some dark. I passed a bus stop with its small digital display flickering. The time jumped between 12:10 and 12:45. I almost laughed at the absurdity, but it came out hollow. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, and I realized the normal noises of the night, the dripping rain, the distant hum of traffic, were amplified in a way that made me hyper-aware of every second passing. I checked the time again on my watch. 12:17, my eyes darted to a clock embedded in the side of a building. 1:03, across the street, the cafe clock read 12:30. My steps faltered. I felt trapped in a loop of moments that refused to line up, my own present stretched and inconsistent in a world that no longer agreed on what time it was. I began to run, each step splashing through puddles, the rain now heavier, misting my face. I passed a store with a large window clock. 11:48, I almost collided with the empty bench in front of it, stopped abruptly, and looked around. The street stretched on, empty, shadows shifting as if they were alive. My phone battery was low, my watch unhelpful, and every clock on the street seemed to mock me. 12:17, 12:30. 1:02, 11:59. My pulse raced, and I realized I no longer knew what now meant. Every glance changed the definition, every step seemed to pull the future slightly off its expected course. Eventually, I reached a small park, the kind I always passed by on my way home. The fountain at its center reflected the flickering street lamps. I stopped, staring at it. There, embedded in the stone archway, was a clock. 12:17, my watch agreed. Relief mixed with fear in a strange cocktail, but as I turned to leave, the park gate clock shifted. 1:11, I froze, feeling that sharp, impossible awareness of being outside normal time. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at that gate. Rain soaked my hair, dripped into my collar, and the city around me stayed impossibly still yet wildly inconsistent. I realized then that I didn't want to move forward, yet I couldn't step back. Eventually, I walked, carefully, slowly, almost holding my breath, keeping my eyes forward, avoiding clocks as much as possible. Each time I risked a glance, the numbers changed. My own body felt disoriented, my internal sense of time fraying with each step. When I reached my apartment finally, I checked the wall clock inside. 12:17, my watch, 12:17. My phone, 12:18. I sighed, exhausted, thinking the worst of it was over. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep. Hours later, I woke and looked at the bedside clock. 12:17, across the room, the microwave digital display blinked 12:45. My phone, silent on the table, read 1:03. I've since avoided checking multiple clocks at once. I carry my watch, I ignore streetlights, I try to keep time to myself. But sometimes, when I step outside at night, the city whispers differently, and I catch a flicker of numbers that don't belong. I've never known if it was a trick of perception, exhaustion, or something more. All I know is this: in that street, on that night, time stopped agreeing with itself, and I walked home alone, every moment uncertain, every second quietly impossible. She was already walking when I noticed her, several meters ahead of me on the narrow sidewalk, her silhouette softened by the rain and the yellow glow of the streetlights, and for a moment I assumed she had simply turned onto the street before I did. It was late, close to 1 in the morning, the kind of hour where the city feels half asleep and every sound carries farther than it should, and the rain had settled into a steady, patient drizzle that soaked into everything without urgency. I had my hands in my coat pockets, shoulders hunched, head down, moving at an even pace that matched my breathing, and I remember feeling strangely calm despite how empty the street was. The woman ahead of me walked slowly, not dragging her feet, not rushing, just steady, her steps quiet against the wet pavement, and I found myself unconsciously matching her rhythm without meaning to. Her coat was dark, her hair indistinct in the low light, and I couldn't tell her age, only that she was alone, like me, moving through the night with no visible destination. I remember thinking that it was a small comfort not to be the only person on the street, even if we weren't walking together, even if there was still distance between us. The streetlights were spaced far apart, leaving long stretches of shadow between them, and each time she passed under one, her shape briefly sharpened before dissolving again into the dimness. I watched the way her shadow stretched behind her, thin and elongated on the wet ground, bending slightly where the pavement dipped, and something about it held my attention longer than it should have. The rain made the ground reflective, turning shadows into darker stains rather than solid shapes, and I noticed how hers seemed unusually defined, darker than mine, almost heavy. I told myself it was just the angle of the light, the way the rain collected in shallow puddles. The way my eyes adjusted slowly in the dark. As we walked, the distance between us didn't seem to change. No matter how I adjusted my pace, speeding up slightly or slowing down just enough to notice, she stayed exactly where she was, always ahead, always just out of reach. I felt a faint irritation at that, the kind that comes when something refuses to resolve itself, when movement doesn't produce the expected result. I checked my surroundings, glancing into shop windows closed for the night, their interiors dark and hollow, my reflection sliding past me in broken fragments. The sound of the rain was constant, filling the silence so completely that it felt intentional, like the night was actively smoothing over any other noise. At the next streetlight, something strange happened. As she stepped forward, her shadow stretched toward me, longer than before, reaching across the wet pavement, and I instinctively slowed down, unsure why. My own shadow stayed close to my feet, faint and uneven, while hers extended back, almost touching my shoes. I told myself it was perspective, that shadows can play tricks when the light is low and the ground is slick, but the feeling that settled in my chest didn't fade. With each step she took, her shadow seemed to lag behind her slightly, as if it were moving at a different pace, as if it belonged to a different rhythm. I kept walking, my eyes flicking between her figure and the ground, aware of how focused I had become on something that should have been insignificant. Then, without changing my speed, I reached her shadow. My foot crossed into it before I realized what was happening, the darker shape swallowing the toe of my shoe while she was still several steps ahead of me. I stopped walking. The rain continued, the streetlights hummed softly, and her footsteps did not slow or pause, even though I had just stepped where her shadow should have ended. For a moment, I stood there, heart beating louder than the rain, staring at the ground, then slowly lifted my gaze back to her. She hadn't turned around. She didn't react. She kept walking as if nothing unusual had happened, her body moving forward while her shadow remained behind me, pulled at my feet. I took a step back. The shadow didn't move. I stepped forward again, and it wrapped around my shoes, dark and unmistakably hers, the outline matching her posture, her stride, everything except its position. A cold awareness settled over me, quiet and heavy, the kind that doesn't cause panic right away but sinks in slowly, making every thought feel deliberate and cautious. I looked up again. She was farther ahead now, the distance finally increasing, her shape growing smaller beneath the next streetlight. Her shadow stayed with me. I turned my body slightly, testing angles, watching how my own shadow shifted while hers remained anchored, stretched unnaturally across the pavement. I felt exposed standing there, as if the street itself had noticed me noticing, and I became aware of how alone I truly was. When I took another step forward, the shadow slid with me, keeping its place, moving like it had decided I was its reference point now. My breathing grew shallow. I told myself not to look back, not to search for explanations in the dark spaces behind me, but the urge was overwhelming. I glanced over my shoulder. There was nothing there. Just the empty street, rain, reflections, and my own shadow faint and distorted beside hers. When I turned back toward her, she was nearly at the end of the block. Another streetlight flickered as she passed beneath it, and for a brief moment, her shadow detached from me, snapping back into place beneath her feet. The sudden normality felt wrong. I stood frozen, watching her continue on, her shadow now behaving as it should, stretching ahead of her instead of behind. She reached the corner and turned without hesitation, disappearing from view. I waited. I don't know how long. The rain soaked through my shoes, my clothes clung to my skin, and the street felt quieter than before, as if it had exhaled and was waiting for me to move. Eventually, I looked down. Only my shadow remained. I started walking again, slower now, more aware of each step, each sound, each reflection, checking the ground beneath me more often than I cared to admit. I didn't take the same route home. I turned down streets I knew well, ones that felt solid and familiar, even though that comfort felt thinner than it used to. When I reached my building, I stood under the entrance light longer than necessary, watching my shadow shift naturally as I moved, reassuring myself with its obedience. Inside my apartment, I locked the door and leaned against it, listening to the rain fade into the distance. I checked the lights, the mirrors, the corners of each room, not because I expected to find anything, but because standing still felt unsafe. That night, lying in bed, I kept thinking about the moment my foot entered her shadow, about how easily it had accepted me, how naturally it had stayed. Sometimes, when I walk alone at night now, I pay close attention to the ground ahead of me, especially when someone walks in front. I make sure I never reach their shadow first. And when I do see my shadow stretch a little farther than it should, I slow down, letting the distance return, even though part of me wonders what would happen if I didn't. I had been taking shortcuts home for years, weaving through narrow alleys that cut between the long blocks of the city. That night, the rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, leaving the bricks slick and glistening under the weak glow of the few streetlights that hadn't burned out. My coat was damp at the shoulders, and I pulled the collar up as I walked, focusing on the rhythm of my own footsteps against the wet pavement. The alley I chose was almost completely empty, tucked between two tall buildings whose windows were dark, except for the faint reflection of the streetlight at the far end. I liked it that way. It felt like a private path, one I could take in thought without interruption. The echo of my shoes against the bricks was steady, comforting, marking time in a way the rest of the city rarely did. About halfway down, I noticed the sound, another set of footsteps, faint at first, in perfect sync with mine. I stopped, hoping it was my imagination, but it didn't stop. The rhythm continued behind me, mirroring me exactly. My heart beat a little faster, though I told myself it had to be someone else in the alley, keeping a respectful distance. I quickened my pace. The footsteps quickened too, perfectly matching my movements. I dared not look behind me, telling myself that whoever it was would reveal themselves eventually, but the silence around the alley pressed in, heavy and thick, and the sound of walking remained constant. The alley was narrow enough that I could reach the end in a few dozen steps, yet it felt impossibly long. Every brick under my shoe seemed to stretch the distance, the end moving farther away as I approached it. I glanced quickly over my shoulder once, and the alley was empty. Nothing. Only the dark walls and the slick pavement reflecting the dim lights above. I moved faster. My own footsteps began to sound louder, echoing off the walls, and yet, the other set never faltered. Every step matched mine. I told myself again it was an echo, a trick of the narrow space, though I knew echoes didn't behave like that. They didn't follow you. They didn't adapt. The alley ended in a small plaza, open and empty, surrounded by more dark buildings. Relief should have come, but when I stopped completely, the second set of footsteps did not stop.